Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the co-owner and creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and in this video, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to manage a relationship with a fearful avoidant attachment style during COVID or during these sort of funny times of uncertainty and isolation that are taking place. So I also wanted to take a moment and acknowledge some of the things that are going on in the world. I made like a much longer video about this 2 or 3 days ago, but I took a pause just to give space for everything that's going on and for people to put their energy towards that and creating understanding right now. And I spent a lot of time as well thinking, like, how do I best serve during these really challenging times? And what I've realized is that one of the best ways that I can serve is to keep creating content that produces knowledge, because the more knowledge people have about trauma and pain, and the less separation we have between us, the more, because here's what happens: knowledge creates understanding of other people. Knowledge about human behavior and people creates understanding. Understanding naturally produces compassion as a byproduct, and the more compassion we have, the more love or care we have for other people. And during this time, one of the most important things we can do is to be for a solution and for the change that we want to see as whole. But we all do that, and we all create change as individuals. There's no like one person or superhero that comes in and saves the day. We all can educate ourselves on some of what's going on, the history, everything that's taking place in the world, up that sort of led us to this point. And from there, we can create more understanding, compassion, and learn to love each other without separation, without judgment, without these barriers that we see the world through out of fear and out of painful conditioned programs that we've assimilated, usually from our childhood or different places in our upbringing. So it's sort of my not duty, but like my intention, with you guys and with our beautiful community here, to produce as much just content and information that's related to trauma and pain during this time as I can. So I would really love some direction on what you guys want to see, what you guys are needing. And so if you want to leave any of that in the comments below, I will be happy to create more specific tailored content to some of your needs during this very uncertain time. And we are also still doing a sale right now to support our community. We're offering 25% off. It's a great space, honestly, to come in and just get community support and not really feel alone during this time. But we're also offering a lot of scholarships. So there's a lot of uncertainty going on. We're trying to do our part, do what we can. So we have different scholarship offerings that we have, including full scholarships. And if you can share anything about yourself and sort of what you're going through, we're really going to work to accommodate different people through some of these challenging times and through some of the isolation that's happening. So let's talk about the content for today, okay? So here's something that's really interesting. Fearful avoidants, more than basically anybody else, are the most out of sight, out of mind of all attachment styles. And this is because one of their natural adaptations is that they tend to start off by being really present with others. And they are so present with others, they tend to naturally feel more, or at least think that they feel more of other people's feelings than they feel their own feelings. And here's why. One of the adaptations a fearful avoidant makes during a traumatic upbringing or childhood, or if being around trauma, maybe from a past adult relationship even, that shifted your attachment style into fearful avoidant, what often happens is you learn to become really, really hypervigilant just to adapt to the environment around you. And so this hypervigilance creates like really intense abilities to be able to read between the lines, micro expressions, body language, tone of voice. And you have, the way that you've adapted to stay safe is usually that the fearful avoidant has like hyper tuned in to the people around them and are really picking up on their feelings and are very present. And fearful avoidants, as a general rule, tend to have very poor emotional boundaries. So here's what takes place out of this, right? Imagine a fearful avoidant is around a whole bunch of people or one person in a relationship, let's say specifically, and then there's space. If they're around people all day, it's like they pour their heart and all of their, thought and emotional energy into their interactions throughout the day. And this can be exhausting, especially if you have poor emotional boundaries, especially if you're like really feeling for other people. And sometimes we think as a fearful avoidant, that you're feeling so much for other people, but sometimes you're actually telling a story about the person's story that they're telling you, and you're creating your own story, and then you're really empathizing with some of your own feelings that get poured into that from a subconscious level. So let's say, for example, that you have a really big fear of being helpless or abandoned, because those are two of the core wounds of fearful avoidance. And let's say you hear somebody telling a story about how they forgot to pick up their son from school on time. And you might be imagining this child, and maybe for all you know, this person's son had a great time after school and was in an after school program, but you might tell this story and imagine this story of this son waiting there and feeling helpless and abandoned and wondering if anybody's going to come back again. And what you may not be realizing is that a part of your subconscious is empathizing based on some of your own big core wounds. So it's a really important thing for fearful avoidance to become aware of, that often they can enter into a space where a lot of their heightened empathy is actually them tapping into and recognizing some of their own core wounds that are coming to the surface, and some of those emotions attached to those core wounds are sort of being ignited or activated, and that can create this hyper sense of empathy as well, which is sometimes more of a reflection of your own feelings or stored traumas from the past. So here's what this creates when it comes to a relationship. Often fearful avoidants get very taxed and exhausted from their interactions with others, but they tend to feel like they need to be so present and so available when they are around others. And so you'll see this natural swinging that's not just from their the ambivalence created from their anxious and avoidant side, that they tend to be swinging sort of like a pendulum back and forth between. But often fearful avoidance will actually have this exhaustion of like being so present and being so there, and then when they're gone from people, because they have a lack of ability to really receive their needs being met from others because it feels too vulnerable and often unsafe, or they're afraid to be a burden, is another really common piece. Then what you'll see is that fearful avoidants, when they're not with people, they tend to be like really withdrawn because they're trying to recharge. And this isn't necessarily a conscious process. They're not like, oh, I need alone time to recharge. I mean, if you're healing as a fearful avoidant, you might recognize this, and then that's fantastic. But often what's happening is this is sort of an unconscious thing where they'll be around people and then they'll withdraw, and then they'll sort of escape or dive into like their creature comforts or coping mechanisms or things to really like protect themselves and take their energy back without all the pressure or expectation they put on themselves to interact in a certain way and be so on when they're with or around other people, especially when they tend to have those poor feeling or emotional based boundaries. So during COVID, what you'll often see is if there's isolation or space in the relationship, you might see that when you're on the phone with this person, you really connect with them, or if you're on, Skype or Zoom or FaceTime, there's this connection because there's that presence, and there might be like a really good ability to bond. But more than any other attachment style, a pattern that I have noticed during COVID is that fearful avoidants tend to be struggling the most in relationships because they want that connection. But then again, when you might have that big bond, but then when there's this out of sight, out of mind thing that happens, it's not that like somebody's not important to them if they're not in their sight. It's that they're so busy when people are in their sight, pouring themselves into those interactions, that when there's a distance, it's like, oh my gosh, they become reclusive and they try to sort of take that space and really recharge. So how a fearful avoidant will often act in a long distance relationship or a relationship during COVID or quarantine or isolation is very much going to depend on the phase of the relationship that the fearful avoidant is in. So for example, in the dating phase, you might see them be more charming, a little bit more consistent, but once they enter into the honeymoon phase, the fearful avoidant is the only attachment style that when they're in honeymoon phase, it's like they already immediately have a foot also in the power struggle phase. And the major reason for this is that fearful avoidants often fear their trust being broken. So the moment there's a commitment towards something, whether it's exclusivity or just more focus on that interaction and more commitment into that person-to-person relationship that brings you into the honeymoon phase, all of a sudden there's something that the fearful avoidant can lose, and there's a trigger that wasn't necessarily there in the casual stages of a relationship that now can be touched because, oh, now there's a commitment, now you might betray that, or now you could, we could fall apart. There could be a loss or an abandonment or a betrayal, a cheating, whatever it is. This usually gets ignited in the honeymoon phase. So what you'll see as a general rule, and I'll probably make a whole series on this because honestly there's so much information to say, and I'll do this for each of the different attachment styles because I know this is something people are really experiencing right now, big time, just the different bumps that come with like these sort of long distance type relationships due to the quarantine. So what you'll see is that usually in the dating phase, the fearful avoidant will be really charming, but you'll probably see them be more out of sight, out of mind than usual, where they're like super present and then super sort of withdrawn. And then you'll see them enter into the honeymoon phase where there will be more volatility than usual. Honeymoon phase, power struggle, even the latter phases of the relationship, which by the way, we have like amazing in-depth courses on the 6 stages of relationship for every single attachment style and how they tend to navigate and operate. Basically what you're going to see in the later stages of the relationship is that these things are magnified. So for example, there's going to be a little more volatility, ambivalence, distrust in the honeymoon stage than usual, in the power struggle stage than usual. Even in the stability stage, there's a pretty high chance that you're going to see some regressive behaviors back into power struggle type of patterns. And then in the commitment phase, it's going to be really challenging. But the one upside to the commitment phase is if you've made it to the commitment phase with the FA, they're usually becoming pretty secure. They've usually done a lot of work. And so in this area, you might see them end up missing you more because it's sort of like the disconnect, but there's enough consistency that's been built into the relationship at that point that there might be the distance that's happening, like the physical environmental distance because of the circumstances of the world right now. But then you might see that they are very open-hearted, warm, loving, because there's sort of that missing, and that commitment almost like acts as a substitute for their avoidant side. It's like it's harder for them to become avoidant because naturally the circumstances are creating more of an avoidant dynamic, which then will polarize the fearful avoidant more into their anxious side. And so you'll see more of that happening in sort of a consistent manner. Now, if you've made it to the bliss stage of a relationship, chances are the fearful avoidant is actually quite secure at this point. They're like a securely attached individual because of changes in their patterns. But old little triggers or remnants, like emotional residue of old triggers, might pop up a little bit more. And so there's so much for me to say about what to do, and I think I'm going to keep that for a separate video. But just some really key points are, number one, maintain your boundaries. Don't get into like walking on eggshells just because of the changes or the fears you have. Make sure you maintain your boundaries. Fearful ones actually respond really well to that with a lot of respect. Then they tend to focus on the relationship more if somebody else has really solid boundaries. Another thing is you can validate their feelings if they're feeling upset. So just, hey, I see that you're in pain right now. Let me know what you need, or like, let's talk about it. Tell me what's going on. These sorts of things. Over explain. Sometimes the distance can trigger that, like, I don't know what you're doing and you might betray me. And those are big core fears that can come up for the FA. So it can be really valuable to over explain and to also express what you are feeling and what you are needing directly, and ask them to do the same. The more direct the communication is, the less the mind is going to fill in the blanks with old wounds, which is really common and really a painful dynamic of what the FA can sometimes bring to the table in a relationship. So those are some key points for now. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if there's anything that I can do to support you guys. Let me know in the comments below. And thank you so much for being here and for being a part of our community. And I will see you in the next video.